In this chapter, we will talk about painting, and mostly what you guys will need to know is the vocabulary that we talked about from this chapter. Now, painting is considered by some the most popular art form, and I put a question mark by this because I think depending on what you're interested in, there may be other types of art that are more interesting to you all. I am a painter, so I also feel kind of weird saying that it's my favorite and teaching, this class. So you'll like whatever you like. But a lot of people really are interested in painting, I think, because it is a flat surface, usually, but it can have an illusion of real space. And it also really opens itself up for self expression and a lot of different things. It's just people tend to be interested in paint quite a bit. Really, the definition of painting is very similar to the definition of drawing. It's basically making marks on a surface with a fluid material. In this case, something we call paint. Technically, painting is said to date back to over 30,000 years ago, and that's back when people would paint on cave walls. Now, their paint was not something that could be bought at the store. It would have been made by hand, probably with their own saliva and maybe pigment that they got from various, locations or sources. Now, what makes paint is something that you need to know for the exam. The pigment, that's where the color comes from. Nowadays, a lot of the pigments we use are synthetic, or there is a synthetic option, which means that it's man made. Traditionally, pigments came from a variety of different sources, from semi precious stones to organs of certain animals, from plant materials, all sorts of things. So, depending on what color you were using, some may have been more expensive or rare to find than others. So that's why, basically before the 1800s, some artists tend to work with only a certain color scheme, is because maybe they could not afford, or maybe they were not in a location where they had access to the full range of colors that we have today. The binder and medium, that is what holds the pigment together and helps it attach to the surface that you're working on. And this is what varies most between the different types of paint that we'll be talking about in this lecture. The vehicle is what helps spread the pigment across the surface. So think of a car driving you from one place to another. So this may be the water or turpentine or heat, whatever the different type of paint requires to help it be more fluid to drag across the surface. Now, other terms you may hear regarding painting are words like gesso or priming. And most of the canvases that you buy at the store, like at places like Azel or Michaels or Hobby Lobby, those canvases have already been primed or treated, and they're ready for you to paint on, usually with oil or acrylic paint. Now, if you make your own canvases, which a lot of artists do, the reason they do is because it's not hard to make your own canvases, and so when you make your own, you can choose what size you want to make. Also, if you want to work really large, it's very, you may not have a car big enough to get the canvas home, and so a lot of people that work really large, like when I want to work really large, I make my own canvases just so that it's easier. And if I make it in my house, it's already here. And if you get stuff like that shipped to you, it can be pretty expensive because of the size. And so whenever you make your own canvases, you tend to work with unprimed canvas, which is a cotton material. And once you stretch it onto the wood form, then you would prime it with gesso. And gesso is a chemical that seals the surface, making the colors more intense, and it also helps make the canvas stronger, and it also protects the canvas, especially if you're working with oil paint. Oil paint actually will eat the cotton fibers, and so if you do not prime or seal the surface, your painting will really destroy itself. And so you have to be careful about that. Now, if you're working with watercolor ink or gouache, those are all technically stains. And with stains, you want them to absorb into the surface. And so with those materials, we mostly work on paper, and therefore you don't need to do anything to the paper because you want those materials to absorb into the surface. Now, these are the different types of paint. Some of these you may have heard of before. Some of them may be new to you. And with these, you may have even heard that some are better than others. And I'm sorry to tell you, they're not one is better than the other. They're just all different. So just like chefs prefer to work with a variety of different materials and techniques, different artists prefer to work with different types of paint. And some may work with a lot of these. Personally, I've used all of these except for fresco, and a lot of these I use at the same time. Like I'll mix them together depending on what I want to do for certain effects. So I've had friends before tell me, "Oh, I only paint with oil paint because it's the highest quality of paint." And I'm like, that's just because that's what you use. So if people say that, they're probably just being a snob and they're trying to tell you that they think what they do is more important than what other people do. And that's not necessarily true. No, the problem is a lot of people will try to use watercolor, but they expect it to look like oil paint. And some of these types of paint, they're not meant to look like each other, and so people choose them by the effect that they have when you use them. So you want to make sure that you're using the right type of paint for the right look that you want to achieve. Hopefully that makes sense. And so we're going to go through each of these: watercolor, ink, gouache, tempera. A lot of times I have students, they say tempura, and that's a type of batter that's used to fry food. So it's tempera paint, not tempura. Okay. Oil, acrylic, encaustic, fresco, and spray paint. Now, in each of these types of paint, I have different a description of it, and then I have advantages and disadvantages. The advantages and disadvantages, it really depends on the person. So some of the advantages may be a disadvantage for someone else depending what they want to do. But watercolor is basically pigment put in a solution of water and gum arabic. And gum arabic is a natural binder that is water soluble. You can buy this in tubes or blocks, and now you can even find it in liquid form. And like I said before, it's a staining process, and people work in thin layers that are called washes. And so the watercolor is thinned down and it makes transparent layers. And so if you were a kid like me, I used to try to use watercolor and I wanted it to be opaque. And it's just never going to be because it's not, it's meant to be transparent. So a lot of people that like to work in layers or thin transparent washes, they prefer to work with watercolor. And if you want to leave an area white, then you just don't paint that part of the paper. Now, again, the advantages and disadvantages, it depends on the person. It says it dries quick, but some people like art that dries quickly. A lot of people will use watercolor for painting landscapes because it's really easy to travel with. All you need is water, and then you can work outside. So it just depends on the person that's working with this. Now, when you work on paper with watercolor, you want to make sure that you have a watercolor paper. And what makes it different than drawing paper is that watercolor paper has cotton in it. And so cotton doesn't disintegrate when it gets wet. It actually expands, where paper pulp is from regular drawing paper that is made from tree particles. And so that will actually dissolve if it gets too saturated with fluid. So you want to make sure you have the right type of paper. Otherwise, it's probably going to wrinkle and fall apart. So here's an example of just a kind of generic watercolor painting, and you can see the transparent layers. And even though a lot of people work more representational with watercolor, you can do all sorts of really cool abstract and very expressive techniques with watercolor as well. Joseph Malley William Turner is a famous British painter who's known for working with watercolor on site, but then he would go back to his studio, and from the watercolors, he would make oil paintings from his memory and from studying the watercolors. So the image on the left is the watercolor, and the image on the right, that is one of his oil paintings. His stuff is very beautiful because I think there's a lot of energy in his work. He was one of the first painters that was using very expressive ways of making marks. And instead of just painting with a tiny brush, he would sometimes dip like a rag into the paint and like wipe it across the surface. And it's rumored that he had like a fingernail that was really long that he would use to scrape and scratch into the paint as well. So he used a bunch of different materials, and I think that's what adds to the intensity of his work. A lot of his work also has this kind of feeling of melancholy to it. It's like you can't tell if you're happy or you're sad. It's kind of like the last day of a vacation. Like you enjoyed it, but you have to go back home, and you may have mixed feelings about that. And a lot of the work, if you look at the subject matter, you get that same feeling. For instance, in the image in the bottom right hand corner, you can see this. Is this a sunset or a sunrise? It depends. Like it depends how you look at it. And then as you notice, you can see this old ship, this wooden ship that sailed probably all over the world, maybe discovered new lands, fought battles, is being pulled by um, a new steam engine that's being dragged to the junkyard to be disassembled and retired. And so some people would see this as new technology, things are way better now, where others would see it as kind of the end of ages and a new beginning. And so I think it kind of adds to that kind of sublime feeling that you feel when you look at his work. William Blake is another 19th century artist, and he was a writer as well. If you take British literature, you may read some of his poetry. He wrote several books of poetry. One was called Songs of Innocence and one Songs of Experience, and I think he wrote a few others as well. And he would often illustrate his own writing and sometimes the writing of other people. I know he did several illustrations of Dante's Inferno, and he would do printmaking intaglio prints that were made with oil ink. And then once they dried, he would go back with watercolor because it was water soluble, and he would hand color them with the watercolor. Now, working with ink, ink is different from watercolor in that it's natural occurring and it's made from trees. And so India ink is a also a stain that's made from trees, and you add different amounts of water to it to create the different gradation of values. And so we also call it washes. And most of the techniques that can be done with watercolor, you can also do with ink, where watercolor has that binder that makes it stay on the paper. Ink is such a powerful stain, it stains it without needing any binder. Okay, and so we can see here the artist has a little plate with different whales in it, and so the more water you add to the ink, the lighter the value will be. And in my drawing class and my design class, I teach my students how to work with India ink, and there's all sorts of really cool techniques like with watercolor that you can do with India ink to create different values, but also do really expressive things as well. Gouache is usually a type of paint that a lot of students don't know what it is. The name is kind of weird. It sounds like a body fluid that's not good, but it's really just a opaque watercolor, and they add chalk to the watercolor to make the colors opaque and kind of pastel looking. A lot of people that work with watercolor, they work with gouache at the same time because a lot of interior designers and fashion designers will use watercolor and gouache together because the watercolor will allow them to represent transparent textiles, where gouache would allow them to represent opaque textiles. So if they have like sheer fabric and opaque fabric, they can use gouache for the opaque and watercolor because it's transparent for the translucent um, fabrics. So here we can see a example of a gouache painting, and you can see it kind of looks like a watercolor painting, but it looks a little bit more opaque. Tempera paint is the binder was traditionally made with eggs, and some people still make it this way. There's a professor at Northlake named Byron Black, and for one of his painting assignment for one of his painting class assignments, he actually makes the students make tempera paint from eggs. And eggs, if you notice, they will dry over time if you don't cook them, and they get kind of sticky. And so that's what the binder is. People would add the pigment to the egg, and they would use the egg whites to make glazes or like transparent kind of colors, and they would use the egg yolks for the opaque colors. Nowadays, there are other chemicals used, but it's also water soluble, and that's how people used to work with tempera paint. Now, the advantages and disadvantages, again, it just depends on the person. And with tempera paint, you can work on canvas, but most people prefer to work on paper or wood, because with wood it's not as flexible, so it won't break and flick off. So here is a basic kind of tempera painting, and you can see that it looks maybe a little bit more um, like you can create different values maybe a little bit more smoothly than you could with watercolor. But I've seen watercolors that look really photorealistic as well. Now, tempera paint has been used for a very long time, and this is an example of an artist during the Renaissance. Even though they had oil paint, some preferred not to work with it. They liked to work with tempera because it dried faster. And Botticelli was one of those artists. He worked on wood panels and canvas using the egg tempera. And you can see it has just as much transparency and opaqueness as the oil paint, but with the tempera paint. You've probably seen this painting of his before. I'm not sure why it didn't load fully, but the Birth of Venus, you've probably all seen this before. But he worked with a lot of secular imagery. Now, oil painting was invented during the Renaissance, and a lot of people really took to liking it, and I think that's why a lot of people like to work with it today too, is because up until the Renaissance, the only types of paint that they had were tempera and encaustic and fresco and watercolor, and those all dried really quickly. And so when oil paint was invented, oil paint can take months to even a year to dry completely. So you had people up to this point working really quickly to now they had the time to slow down. And so that's why some people like to work with it. But we've all probably spilled oil on our countertops before when we were cooking, and maybe you didn't see where it splattered to clean it up. And then later you came back and it was kind of getting dry and sticky, and it was harder to clean up. So oil will actually dry over time. And so people started adding pigment to usually linseed or sapphire oil, and they would make paint with it. And then turpentine was the traditional chemical that was used to thin it down. And nowadays, people use linseed oil to add to it. There's also a water soluble oil paint and a safe turpentine that can be poured down the sink. Traditional turpentine is pretty toxic and not very safe to work with. But one of the cool things about oil paint is that you can add oil or turpentine to it to thin it down and create really thin, almost like glass like layers that we call glazes. And those can dry, and then you can layer more on top of them. And or you can create really thick strokes like Van Gogh did, which we call impasto. And there actually is a material you can add to oil paint called impasto that makes it really thick, like icing, like Van Gogh used. So again, advantages and disadvantages, it just depends on the person and who's using it. Like I said, I like working with oil paint, but if I want to work fast, acrylic or one of the others is probably going to dry a little faster, especially if you like to work in layers. You don't really want to wait a month, in between each layer, especially when you could work with acrylic where you could, do several layers in one night. So this is just an example of a oil painting. You can see it's kind of hard just looking. It's hard to tell what type of paint is being used. So I'm not going to use any visual visual parts on the next test. It's going to be more just vocabulary. So Diego Velasquez, I threw him as now acrylic paint. That was not invented until the mid 1900s, and it was invented for industrial purposes. People were wanting a type of paint that they could put on tools and things that they want to leave outside that would be waterproof. Now, what made it waterproof was that it was made from liquid plastic, or what we call acrylic polymer. And the pigment was added to that. And then whenever that paint dried, it became plastic. And whenever artists heard about this liquid plastic paint, they were like, well, we want to try this as well. And because that it was mostly synthetic, it would stick to almost anything. And so you could use it on wood, you could use it on paper, you could use it on canvas. It was a pretty versatile paint that had been created. And shortly after it being invented for industrial purposes, slowly art companies started making um, artist versions of this type of paint. The really cool thing about acrylic paint is that while it's wet, it's water soluble, but once it dries, it becomes waterproof. Again, the advantages and disadvantages, it depends on the person. I probably work with acrylic paint more than anything else just because I like to work really fast and I like to work with a lot of layers. And acrylic paint can be made to look like watercolor, it can be made to look like oil paint. It can really, there's all sorts of additives that you can add to it to make it do different things. So it's very versatile. And some people complain that it dries too fast, but it really doesn't. If you're working with it the right way, there's ways of keeping it wet longer. There's even a material that you can add to it that keeps it from drying, and it gives you a little bit more time to work with it. So here's just an example of kind of a generic acrylic painting. And then here is one of the first acrylic painters. His name was David Hockney. He's still alive, and he is a photographer and a painter. And he painted this with acrylic in 1970. So it was still a fairly new type of paint then. And what I wanted you to see is that he was able to work with it and make it in places kind of look like watercolor, like out on the balcony where the sunlight is coming in. But then in other places, like with the carpet and the vase of flowers, you can see it almost looks like oil paint. So he really pushed this new type of paint in a direction that people had never seen before. These were some of his other pieces that he did. He liked to paint his swimming pool a lot, and the image on the right is actually a self-portrait of him. Audrey Flack is another artist that she was a photorealist painter, and you can go to this link to see some of her work. But whenever I have students that complain, like, oh, acrylic paint dries too fast, I show them her work because it looks like a photograph. And that's what she was known for, is being a photorealist painter because her paintings look so realistic. But she mostly used acrylic paint, and then she would use some enamel, like for some of the really shiny parts of it. But she's also an artist that works super photorealistic, but also she worked non-objective as well. So some days she felt like working with imagery, and other days she abandoned imagery altogether. And she also did sculpture and things like that as well. But feel free to look at her website, you'll be amazed. Now, encaustic is another type of paint, and a lot of people don't know about this one, and it's because it's one of the oldest types of paint, but it's also one of the newest types of paint. And the reason is there were no art history books written before the Renaissance. And so during the Renaissance, the only types of paint that were known were tempera paint uh, and oil paint and fresco painting. And so those were the only three. And people hadn't known about encaustic because it had been used in ancient times, mostly by the ancient uh, Egyptians. And mostly the paintings that were done in encaustic were buried in tombs. And so by the time of the Renaissance, people had forgotten about it altogether. And so when the first art history book was written, they didn't write about it as one of the traditional types of painting. But then around the time of Napoleon's rule, he started excavating ancient ruins. And while in Egypt, his troops had discovered over 800 of these wax paintings that they found in tombs in the Fayum Desert. And after that, all of a sudden, people were like, what is this type of paint? How do we do this? And because the history had been lost, people had to relearn how to work with this type of paint. And now, with technology, with electricity, we can work with it a lot easier than the ancient Egyptians and Greeks and Romans had worked with it. But what is unique to encaustic is that the binder is beeswax. And so you literally have to melt beeswax and then you add these tree wax crystals to it. And that raises the melting point to over 200 degrees. So it doesn't melt like crayons and other types of waxes that have like paraffin in them. Beeswax has a very high melting point. And when you paint with it while it's melted, it almost has like a shiny, rich surface to it that looks like wax, but it can look really realistic as well. And most of the people during ancient times, they preferred to work with it to do portraits because it kind of looked like the texture of our skin. And this is something I've been using since about 2005. I took some classes in it and I still use it. I like to work with it quite a bit, but in the summer, it's not as much fun because it's already hot outside and you have to melt the wax and all of that. So these are some advantages and disadvantages. Again, it just depends on the person. If you overheat the wax, though, it will catch on fire and burn like a candle. So you have to be careful to work with it. These are some of my friends and some centers in Dallas where you can take classes in encaustic. Now, these are some of those portraits that were found from ancient times, but they weren't found until Napoleon's rule. And you can see the portraits are all kind of shaped kind of funny. And the reason is these would have been put on top of a mummy or on top of a sarcophagus. So they would do these portraits, and then when they passed away, they would put it in their mummy almost as like their face looking out. And if you Google Fayum portraits, you can see images of them intact with the wrapped corpse as well. Now, nobody knows what age exactly that the people had the portraits made, but in some of the books, they found that it says that it was at their most beautiful state. And so I don't know if the family decided, like, hey, you're not getting any cuter, let's have your portrait made or what. But at different stages of your life, you would have these wax paintings done. And then when you passed away, this would be put in your sarcophagus or your mummy. Now, in the 1930s, Jasper Johns was born, and he had heard about encaustic and wanted to work with it. And with electricity, of course, helping control the temperature of the wax, he started doing a variety of encaustic paintings, and a lot of people give him credit for bringing it to the modern era. And so these are some of his pieces that he used a lot of things. And because beeswax is used, beeswax is a natural preservative. So you can collage stuff and it traps it in there. So it's really fun to mix other things with the wax when you work with it. Now, fresco is a type of paint that dates back to ancient times. It's also one of the oldest types of paint. Traditionally, artists would put down wet limestone plaster in small sections, and while it was wet, they would add colored pigment on top of it and water. And the pigment and the plaster had to dry together to make a permanent bond. And that's how, for a long time, artists did murals. And so, a lot of the murals that we've talked about in this class and a lot of the mural artists, this is how that they would have done it. It was very time consuming, and usually it wasn't something that you did by yourself. You had to have an assistant to help you. So, advantages and disadvantages. One of the advantages about it is that it does get more colorful over time, usually about 50 to 100 years after the paintings are made. They say the colors are at their most intense state. Here's an example of people working in the fresco technique. You can see the assistant is already applying the next layer of wet limestone, and then the artist is following the first layer that's been put down, painting on top of it while it's wet. Now, this is a painting from the ancient Minoan civilization, and this dates back to BCE times. So, like I said, this is a very old painting process, and it's what was used to decorate the inside of homes, the outside of walls. It was a very popular process where they would put the limestone on the walls and then paint on top of it. And in this landscape, this kind of abstract, it almost looks like a Dr. Seuss landscape. You can see all these saffron flowers and birds in the sky. And these people, they lived a very good life, and they celebrated that with their beautiful landscapes, bringing some of that inside of their homes. Now, we talked about Michelangelo before, and I think I told you about the Sistine Chapel ceiling and how he was forced to paint this. And that's the process. The fresco painting is what he used to paint the ceiling. And he had to do this for 4 years of his life, and he didn't really want to do it at all. So it goes to show you that even when we have to do things we don't like, if we do our best, who knows? Like, it could be a world masterpiece someday. But this painting is so high up in the air, and he had to use handmade scaffolding. This is again before electricity or any of the technology we have today. And he had to get up there every day, for 4 years to paint all these different scenes from the Bible. And it's just breathtaking that he was able to do that. Now, for years, people thought that he used all these dark colors because the ceiling had gotten so dirty from all the years of burning candles and incense inside of the church. But later they realized that it was just dirty, and they spent time restoring it to discover all these really bright, beautiful colors underneath it. Now, when I took this class, I'm not going to say how many years ago, my professors made us memorize all the layout of all the biblical stories. And on our test, we had to label them correctly just on a blank diagram. I'm not going to do that. You're welcome. But that's how hard it could be. So don't tell me my class is hard. All right. This is one of the most famous scenes, the creation of Adam. And I show you this because I know with Leonardo da Vinci's work, I talked about his fascination with anatomy. And it's believed that Michelangelo also had the same fascination with anatomy. And it can be seen in his obviously knowledge of the muscles and bones and builds of the body. And maybe being a sculptor, that helped him understand that more as well. But there have been people make diagrams showing how this right side, where we see God and angels, this outlining red fabric, people have overlaid it with a cross section of the human brain, and it lines up almost perfectly with the human brain. So they think that maybe even Michelangelo was dabbling in anatomical studies and things like that as well. Diego Rivera, we talked about him before. He also used the fresco technique, and this was a mural that he painted in New York City, and it was a big, huge commission that was in the Rockefeller Building in New York City. And shortly after he painted it, though, it was torn down off the wall because he painted some communists and other political parties that weren't really being celebrated in America at that time, and so it was seen as he was paid for it, but he was told if he didn't change it that they were going to tear it down, and surely they did. Later, he repainted it though in Mexico City, and then I threw in spray paint and house paint because the house paint is made for the exterior and interior of our homes, and spray paint was also invented for an industrial purpose as well. However, instead of working with the fresco technique, a lot of mural artists today work with house paint or latex paint, and they work with spray paint. And so now, just in the last 10 years, I've seen that a lot of the art companies are making um, latex based paints, which are very much like acrylic, that are for murals. And they're also making spray paint that is for artists to work with as well. where back in the day people would use spray paint for graffiti, but they just had to figure out all the tricks on their own. Where now a lot of the artist grade spray paint has different tips and caps that you can put on it to create different effects. So who knows? Someday I imagine that there will be classes at colleges and universities just on working with spray paint. So these are just some examples to show some of the cool techniques over the years that artists have developed with working with spray paint.